So just as value creation can occur through diversification, and it's generally the goal of a healthy and productive company with a healthy and productive management team. Sometimes you can have value reducing diversification. Sometimes you can have value neutral diversification. That can happen for a couple of reasons. Sometimes the diversification just does not work out as it was expected to. Obviously, that would be value neutral. But in some instances, firms attempt to grow the profit pool so that shareholders will have bigger returns on their investments. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. If we can grow our profit pool, maybe keep our margins the same, we maybe can pay our shareholders a little bit more. Sometimes our company is trying to grow big to gain market power, and the only way that we can go big is to diversify, and that might be value neutral. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a specific example of that. But just to get your juices flowing and get you thinking about it, think about some of the stuff that happened. You can have external incentives that cause you to diversify. For example, think about it if you were in the insurance industry and you were selling health insurance. Health insurance is, of course, very highly regulated and became even more regulated with the Affordable Care and Patient Protection Act, Affordable Care and Patient Protection Act. Companies that were health insurers had the opportunity to completely leave that market if they wanted to avoid those increasing and heavier regulations. However, a lot of insurance didn't initially leave the marketplace. What they actually did was they got into other lines of insurance or other lines of investments or other financial products in an attempt to lower the risk associated with being in that health insurance marketplace. So sometimes those external incentives can force us to diversify, and it's just value neutral because we're trying to retain our profitability at that certain level so that we can satisfy our shareholders. Sometimes antitrust legislation or regulations, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, can get involved. I'm going to share a little story with you about this little character that you see down there. But regulations tend to come and go, and they tend to be a little bit cyclical. You can see the pattern here in the 60s and 70s. Antitrust laws prohibited mergers that created increased market power. Very much an anti-diversification, anti-market power environment. So most mergers at that time had to be conglomerate, unrelated diversification. In the 80s and 90s, merger constraints were relaxed, and you had a lot more horizontal and vertical acquisitions, acquisitions of target firms within the same line of business, or moving up or down the supply chain. In the early 2000s, antitrust concerns emerged again. Mergers received a lot more scrutiny. So the reason I've got this little Miss Sunbeam, this logo down in the corner, is I want to share with you a very personal story about my career. Very early in my career, right out of high school, as a matter of fact, my brother and I purchased the assets of a failed hardware store in our hometown. And this is a little tiny town of about 800 people. And we operated that hardware store as a partnership. I was the younger brother, so I was the minority partner in the business. We operated that. But over the first few years of business, I had a gentleman who would come in on Saturday afternoon, and he would quite often sit and talk with me. His name was Heath Varnado. And I didn't know Mr. Varnado very well initially, but I got to know him over time. And it turns out Mr. Varnado was actually the CEO of Flowers Foods, which was headquartered in Thomasville, Georgia, which was where I went to high school. It's very close to my hometown, about 17 miles from my hometown. Mr. Varnado not only was the CEO of Flowers Foods, but he was also what we would refer to as a gentleman farmer. He had a relatively large tract of land, several hundred acres, just outside of our hometown there, and he would come out and spend the weekends on the farm. And he had pecan trees, and he would do a little bit of row crops, and he had some hunting properties, and he would bring corporate bigwigs out there and stuff. So Mr. Varnado got to be very interested in me and my brother and why such young people were doing what we were doing. And over time, he would come in on Saturday afternoon, and he'd just sit and talk, and we got to know one another very well. And Mr. Varnado began to know I was a little dissatisfied in the business. And he told me, he said, if you ever decide that you want to leave when you get done with college, come see me, and we'll talk about a position for you there within Flowers. So I did. This was one of their products. Sunbeam Bread was one of their licensed products that they produce, and you've probably seen that. If you're familiar with the Nature's Own line of products, you're familiar with Flowers Foods and Flowers Baking Company. So I just want to show you a little bit about them, because when I was in Mr. Varnado's office at Flowers Foods, this would have been in the summer of 1990. This is their headquarters. As you can see, they're traded on the New York Stock Exchange. They're part of the S&P 400. They've been around a little over 100 years now. This was their corporate headquarters. This office right here on the upper left-hand side of the building was Mr. Varnado's office, and he was the CEO. He was the chief executive officer. I interviewed in that office with Mr. Varnado there in the summer of 1990 as I was graduating with my undergraduate degree. It was quite interesting. The reason that I bring this conversation in during this particular lecture is while I was in the office interviewing with Mr. Varnado, he received a telephone call from the Federal Trade Commission. And that Federal Trade Commission call was about $100 million antitrust lawsuit that was going on at the time. So if you look at the history or the timeline of acquisitions for the company, they have bought and acquired a lot of baking companies, and they've gone from being just a southeastern regional baker to being a very large nationwide company. They've bought Buttercrust, Captain John Durst, Royal Cake, Tasty Cakes. They bought a lot of the stuff, a lot of the assets of Hostess brands, the Twinkies and whatnot. They're purchased some of the licenses from Bimbo Bakeries, which is the Mexican bakery that's largest in the world, and they purchased some assets from Sara Lee and Earth Grains and some others. As I mentioned, Hostess brands, they bought Wonder Bread, and they bought 20 of the bakeries. So you can see a little bit about the history. This was very much diversification that was value neutral. They had a mandate from the board of directors to grow the company, and as you can see, it's a really big company, about $4 billion in annual revenues with almost 10,000 employees. They had a mandate to grow that profit pool, but because there was that antitrust legislation going on, or antitrust litigation rather, going on from the FTC at the time, they could not do related diversification. They could not buy other baking companies, other bread companies, so they were being sued. So that's kind of what led them into the Hostess brands and the Sara Lee and that kind of stuff. The company kind of lost its way for a while, but they're doing very well today. They're still traded on the New York Stock Exchange. At the time that I interviewed with them, they were on the Fortune 500 list of the largest U.S. companies. Very, very interesting that in a town of less than 20,000 people, you would have the headquarters of this big, huge baking company. It just relates a little bit to what we're talking about here, to this value neutral diversification. They were growing. They had to acquire other business lines. They could not acquire any more bakeries because there was the concern that they were becoming a monopoly. So that's their motivation for doing the unrelated or the related constrained diversification. They were trying to grow their profit pool. Okay? All right. Thanks so much.